So today and Thursday, we'll handle privacy and confidentiality. And on Thursday, to be more pertinent to confidentiality, how it applies to nurses per se. Now, like a little heads up on that, it's been the last few decades that you've seen nurses come into their own, right, as healthcare professionals. So a lot of the maybe legal aspects surrounding privacy don't impinge on the nurse as much as they do the physician, but that could change because what we're going to do today is we're going to look at a real basic distinction between privacy and confidentiality. We're going to look exactly like the philosophical underpinnings of privacy and how it developed, and then we're going to look at say like the moral responses and how like we would as healthcare workers react to that, and what are some of the criteria. And then the very last thing we're going to do is look like an evolution of some legal cases as to how did privacy get connected to medical ethics in the way that we see today. So I won't get ahead. We'll leave that for the time being. Now, right up front, you're going to notice that I have the heading here about maintaining trust. We all know if we've been in like intimate situations, and I don't, I mean anything that's close relational, if there's a breach of trust, that takes a while for it to heal. And sometimes it never really entirely heals. It's always in the back of our heads a little bit, right? You could disagree, but sometimes depending on situation, like as an ethicist, I'm not a marriage counselor, but if I'm talking to people that might have been involved in marital infidelity, depending on the particular circumstances, sometimes it's best to leave it as is. If it was like a happening, there's no real deep psychological connection, because the reason is that it's not that you want to lie, so you never lie about it, but it's one of those things that trust is a difficult thing to overcome. All right. And maybe I shouldn't have said that, because the context of that is in friends that I have that are ministers and are priests that share with me how they handle it. And in some circumstances, I understand why they withhold. But my whole point to this is that trust is a very difficult thing to nurture, and it's a very easy thing to dislodge. So we have to almost stay on the side of caution, especially from a healthcare point of view, to make sure that you maintain, the conditions of trust of the patient. So I'm going to talk to you real briefly about the distinction between confidentiality and privacy, and I don't want you to overthink them per se, because really, depending on who you speak to, these things could be little more than synonyms. Typically, privacy has something to do with the legal aspects, data transmission and such, and confidentiality more so as to like what was said in confidence. So think of the difference between what, say, perhaps a friend of yours could or not legally say about you that would cause liable, or things that you just say that as friends you expect them to keep it to themselves. So I'm going to give you just a real quick synopsis on how you might understand the difference. And if you're able to relate back nothing more than what I give you, that's perfectly fine, right? When people go to healthcare workers, you have an expectation of confidence. In other words, what I say there, you intend for it to remain there. If you go, but you're being treated for the fact that you're anything else that's surrounding. If you go in there and talk about, issues with your mother, which could easily come up in a physician-patient relationship. And I don't mean in terms of abuse or something, they'd have to report that. I mean that if you start to talk about being affected psychologically, you're suffering from depression, you start talking about your parents and maybe they're going through a divorce and what's all going on, well, that stuff is expected to stay in. It's not something that goes on your charts, but it's something that's expected to stay within the realm of patient, doctor, or physician relationship based on confidence. So we can really understand confidence in terms of there are boundaries that are guarded. In other words, there's fences put around what's being told so that it won't get out of here, because it's not even a matter of it like being a legal issue, but it could just cause embarrassment. In other words, perhaps a person's going in and talking about issues with their spouse who's struggling with alcoholism. Okay, well, the spouse is not the doctor's patient, but the doctor can't go out and start talking about, oh, this one patient I have, their husband's an alcoholic, right? So there's boundaries that surround that relationship. With privacy, let's think it's in terms of more so of the legality. In other words, you're not sharing like the conditions that the person would have. You're not sharing the treatment that they're having. You're not sharing perhaps the medicines, the pharmaceuticals they're on. So what you are going to do is you're going to maintain professional silence. What is in that room stays in that room. And unless it's for the endangerment of the individual, they themselves are endangered, or because there are exceptions, right? If they are in danger, or if somebody else is endangered because of them, like there's a homicidal inclination that they would name somebody personally, like I'm going to do this, those would be reasons to breach this. But otherwise, it's expected that you maintain professional silence so that they have a real comfort level when they're in a particular room with you. Now, these things govern physician-patient relationships more so than nurses-patient relationships, which we're going to talk about on Thursday. But like I said, you're seeing nurses come into their own, and I imagine some of this will change. And some of this does already apply. I mean, just because you're not a physician per se doesn't mean that you can share, who was in for their chemotherapy or such. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But those are just like the general distinctions between confidentiality and privacy. Sometimes people use them synonymously. I've seen them used back and forth. You could say, well, at what point are you breaching confidence where you've now broken into the area of privacy? We're not going to here to make the distinctions. Typically, confidentiality deals more with like ethical components, like what would just be good reasoning and what would you do that maybe it's not you are not legally bound to, but still is necessary for you to maintain trust. And we'll leave privacy as those things put very strict legal parameters upon what you may or may not share. And these are all for very good reasons. So I know that's kind of a little vague and a quick one, but any questions on that? You could chime in any time too. All right, so I said I want to talk, the philosophical underpinnings of how the ethics for privacy were developed. So a very important component from the time of the ancient Greeks about philosophy is, human flourishing. So, human flourishing, think in terms of whatever's necessary in our culture, in our life, in our social political sphere that's necessary for us to achieve goods. In other words, they make us flourish for human beings. So they're directly connected to needs that we have as human beings. We would say privacy falls under one of the needs as a common good. So if we wanted to look at like inclinations of the human person, like I even said from natural law, we could say, do good and avoid evil, predication for truth, the willingness or the desire to be living in relation, to preserve one's own life. If these things are necessary goods for us, then remember you have to develop particular duties that help us preserve those goods, and then rights are usually brought on to enshrine those things. So the right for a person to defend themselves, the right for a person to have basic health care, all those types of things that are rights that are based on what has been determined as a common good for the human person. Okay, so when we talk about privacy fits into all of that, right? So, you have to always have some development of what is or is not a person and how you develop personhood. But we're usually going to say that there are certain interests that we have. And as rational beings, we can determine that those interests are worth preserving. So in other words, this would probably fall under, we'd even said the natural inclination for our desire for truth. And part of that truth is that we're protected from how those truths get disseminated about us. Just because something is known about us doesn't mean that it has to be disclosed. Like if this were a pure ethics course, and if I were dealing in virtue ethics, I'd walk you through like at least the cardinal virtues. And then when we got to justice, which we've already talked about as, willing the good of the other, we would also, though, talk about what are the vices opposed to that. Like, in other words, when does justice start to get eroded? And two of the vices that are opposed to justice, so if you think, again, doing good for the other, this would be you're willing to good for some of the other reason. So two of them, one would be tale-bearing, which we pretty much just understand as gossip, right? It's questionable truths, and you're just spreading it about. But the other one would be calumny. And calumny is when you reveal something that is true, but the other person doesn't have any right to that information. For instance, just forget about medical ethics for a second, but if you were just talking to a friend of yours and you told him about your mother's brother who's an alcoholic, now, if your mother found out about that, she might say, why in God's name are you telling somebody about my brother? And you would probably respond, or I would, right? Well, it's true, isn't it? See that, but that's still calming because the person has no right to that particular information. So, all they've done is they've tried to take what their understanding of justice is and some of the parameters that are involving that. And then we're applying this based on the fact that we are rational persons and it's connected to us as human flourishing. Philosophy, and in particular ethics, which is applied philosophy, has something to say in this realm. Okay, so which is why you're getting, medical ethics from a philosopher and perhaps not from just a strict scientist. And even if it was a scientist, you'd have to have a background in this to be able to comprehend. So, any questions on that? I'm going to give you a real quick run by here on some different types of privacy, right? These aren't entirely mutually exclusive. In other words, perhaps one seems a little bit to bleed in the other. That's to be expected, right? But nonetheless, informational privacy, think of just information. Think of data and records and charts and things like that. But it could also include like who's being seen in the office, right? Who's been admitted to the hospital. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about Hipaa Logs on Thursday when we talk about confidentiality in terms of nursing. But Hipaa laws obviously apply to everybody. This doesn't have so much to do whether or not we agree with everything. We're bound by this nonetheless. So at a nursing facility, if there are two individuals in a room and one's brought out for immediate, emergency care and then passes away, they can't even go back and tell the person who was that individual's roommate. So, and my wife sees this all the time. I've been a roommate for 6 years and I don't even know what happened. It's not even because they're waiting to notify the family. That seems to be reasonable. Even after that, Hipaa laws constrict who can be told. So I have to almost just pretend like they don't know. So nonetheless, my cousin, who's an oncologist nurse, I went to my uncle's funeral over Christmas. Now, this isn't her dad, but she came to me and she said, he was coming in for chemo. And the entire time he kept pointing his finger at me and saying, don't you ever tell anybody that I was here. Well, she said, of course I won't, but she couldn't anyway. I mean, that's part of it. I mean, the fact that you're there for treatment, and we're going to see that this leads into associational privacy. The fact that you're there, that's confidential and private information. Physical privacy can really take two forms. It could be in terms of modesty, or it could be in terms of body integrity. If it's in terms of modesty, just think of how, think of the intimate parts that you're going to see of patients and how vulnerable they feel in those particular instances, right? So you're going to be cleaning them, you're going to be doing, wound identification, bruise checks, all these types of things. And the person's, not everybody's used to being, sometimes stark naked in front of other people around. So it's not even appropriate to comment on what you see. It's one to say, oh boy, you have some bruises here. That's perfectly fine. But you couldn't go out into the corridor and start sharing it with other nurses, like, oh my God, she had this bruise. Like, that's something that, even if it seems like it's just a cathartic release, right? It's still information that's supposed to be kept private between you and that particular patient. Also, integrity is, in other words, there might be certain mandatory testing. If the individual's, say, coming in for a workman's comp claim, they're going to do urine tests for alcoholism and everything else. Any mandatory testing, that's to be kept private. Body integrity, because these things we have to almost, even if this isn't the absolute way to hear it, it's a good way to understand is that a lot of these things become extensions of the individual, right? So even if we want to say something in post-mortem, like about, and this happens, right? Sperm extraction from the male. So it could be frozen and perhaps used to, IVF later on. That type of stuff is very private because even though that seems like it's a separate property, it's not. It's still part of the body per se. As is organ harvesting, right? So which is why not only do we consent to it, but just because a person has passed doesn't mean that we no longer have some sort of control over the privacy of their body. So, we'll see, we won't look at specific court cases, but you'll see how a lot of this stuff has been developed, not just through the custom and use, how things have worked out and they built their own protocol, but certain court cases that said this is how we're going to do it. And then even places that are nearby in another state might follow suit out of fear for the same thing, right? So anyway, associational privacy has like an inkling with the informational, but you can't really even share that a person's ill, what their illness is, that they're in recovery, that they're near death, that they beat death, that type of thing. That they're in there having children. It might seem like it's, you know, a person's in there having a child. Why wouldn't somebody else want to know? Because you have no idea what the family dynamics is. You don't know who is there a husband, and this is not the husband's. You have no idea is this the parent. I mean, you can't even come up with the scenarios. I mean, everything that we've ever seen on Law and Order in a Lifetime movie, as strange as it might be, is absolutely real somewhere, right? This would also talk here in associational about photographs. So I read a lot of case studies. So if this was in your text, you might have seen it or will see it. There was a nursing student who was assigned to a particular pediatric cancer ward, we'll say, unit in a hospital. And one of the young patients, he just loved her and said, well, you know, will you take a picture of me? So you took a picture of her and this little 3-year-old, and then she puts it up on her social media, like, here's my little hero fighting leukemia. Well, that became a very serious legal breach of privacy. Not only did that individual either lose her license or never stay in the school, but the entire program was dismissed from participating in that particular ward. So, I mean, just, you know, so the intention has nothing to do with it. You would think, well, God, that was pretty harsh, but people have a right to these things. I know my wife has been working with some people, like the older individuals. She can't take their pictures, even put them up on like the bulletin boards and stuff. Now, have they swung a little bit too far? They might have, right? But that's really not for us to, you know, try to mete out. It is what it is, and all I'm saying is there's a reason behind it. If things were too lax 30 to 40 years ago, which they were, and they're a little bit too strict now, who knows how it might clean up in the future, but we'll see. Okay. Proprietary are things that are truly, you know, something that you would consider very close to you as personhood. Think of genetic screenings. Think of DNA testing. Think of lab reports. You know, these things are very personal. And even though they seem like they're separate, like a DNA test, that's not really you. But it's so central to who we are as individuals and our own personhood. By extension, it is sort of that, you know? So these types of things, which, you know, we're in this age now, we're going to look a little bit at social media on Tuesday. You know, these are, as far as data breaches and such, the informational, what is proprietary, it would be too hard for some of these things to get out. I want to say something else, though, about the associational that I totally forgot, is that, you know, this isn't even, you know, nurses sharing information with each other about, you know, patients they have. It's like, let it go. This also would be for like family members wandering around the halls. Now, I'm not talking about something nefarious or creepy, because it's just, you know, it's easy to get lost in a hospital. I know when I was visiting my father-in-law at Wilkes-Barre General, my God, I was so disoriented where I was at. I didn't even know where I was walking. Next thing I know, I'm walking around. Well, doors are open. And if you're in a particular area that has either glass walls or it's an ICU unit, you're going to be able to see everything that goes on inside there. It's not inappropriate for the nurse to come over and just politely ask, can I help you? Because they realize that that person has privacy, and it's not you know, you don't have a right just to wander around. They realize you're lost, but nonetheless, right? So those things are just things to keep in mind. Anyway, back to the proprietary, right? Any of these types of things that become for us unique genetic identifiers, they become very personal. This would even extend to like frozen embryos. And I know that may not be something that you personally get involved with, but you know, with a lot of IVF, I mean, if you know anything about IVF, once the woman is hyperovulated, they don't just fertilize 2 embryos and then insert 2 embryos. They might fertilize 5, 6, 7, and then insert 2, and then the rest of them get cryogenically preserved. By the way, just as a little side note, everybody remember Octomom from, I don't know, 10 years ago or so? She had, I don't know, like 8 kids, right? Everybody was really upset about that, but that was an IVF where she refused to have any of them cryogenic curves, so she wanted them all and be took. Right, so that's how that happened. But nonetheless, that's a side note. And these things extend even after death. So it's not unlike sperm collection from a person who's recently deceased, but there have been cases where you have an individual who, mother and father have, fertilized these eggs, they're cryogenically frozen, and then the parents die, or one of the parents dies. And whose property is this? Does the stepmom get to have the implantation of the her previous husband's, deceased wife? So these things are all legal court cases. But the reason why typically they would, fall under the at least the legal and ethical realm of privacy is based on an understanding of proprietary. Okay. Decisional is would include things like, our autonomy of choice and anything that would help us make decisions. So this would include things like contraception, abortion, and IVF. And this also would include our end-of-life issues and the right to refuse care. That's all falls under a right of privacy per se. Yeah, I guess that's it. It's kind of a flat ending, but nonetheless, any questions on the different types? And again, I just want you to know something about them. I realize that informational and associational could have some bleed over, and associational, proprietary, but there are things that are somewhat exclusive to them. And if you feel like that's a safer way to do it in an essay question, then I suggest doing that. But any questions? We do have a case study at the end of this, but I'm going to warn you now, it has one of those bad endings that nobody liked. So make up a story to make everybody happy. We'll get into that. Okay, so even if we come up with an idea on what the parameters of this privacy are, and we understand why we have them and such, it's a whole other thing to try to figure out, well, how do we actually help then support, patients in their privacy? And none of this is obvious, even if it sounds obvious, now, it really isn't per se. Part of the issue is that a person's determination of what they want private, it differs, right? So everybody has different thresholds. We all know people who are oversharers, like, okay, dude, enough, right? And then we know people that they're comfortable sharing. And then we know people that are reluctant. And then we know people that are like steel lock boxes. You can't get anything out of them. So the point of it is that the patient may feel comfortable with you sharing something, but they're not the standard, right? So a person's subjective standard, well, let me put it this way, a person's subjective threshold is not the standard. So it doesn't matter what they feel comfortable. Hey, I don't care who you tell my blood work to. What's the matter to me? It's not, it's not like it was written in stone. That doesn't matter, right? But we all know that not everybody feels this way. I have a friend who, one of the nicest guys I ever met. I went to high school with him. He's doing fine, but he was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, so he had a pretty high AC1, and also fasting glucose level was pretty high, and he was way overweight. So he went on some medicine, of course, but he's also been trying to do a lot with diet and exercise. So he was so proud of himself that he'd lost like 30 pounds and got his AC1 down by 3.5 points and his fasting glucose down by 40 points. So he gets his blood work back and he puts all that on Facebook. Like, hey, look how good I'm doing. And I'm like, oh my God. Now, here's a guy that, is absolutely sharing. Any you in a profession would do that, obviously lose your job immediately. And you would know that. But again, he would be much more comfortable than others. So we never use the patient's own subjective threshold to determine what is the standard of what we share. And like anything else, you're always playing on the side of caution, right? I mean, professors do that in the room all the time. You never know exactly how something's going to be taken. It's a little unfortunate, but you stay on the side of caution just because you want to make sure that you're not traveling into a gray area where something could be misconstrued, because it could be a career ender pretty quick, right? As you well know, the legal system and the lawyers and the HR department is always going to always going to be on the side of caution. And the side of caution is it's easier to get rid of you than to deal with this through litigants. They're going to get rid of you or I or anybody, right? Okay, so I'm going to give you two Kantian and two utilitarian ways. In other words, I'm trying to give an overview for like where did this develop and how did the medical field come up with ways to say this is a good way to morally support people's medical privacy. So remember in Kant's ontology, this rule-based ethical system, remember the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative, again, at least one of the expressions was that you should develop a maxim that really only allows you to do what you could will for everybody else to do. In other words, whatever it is that you choose is good for yourself. You can only do it if you think that everybody should be able to do this. And if you get to that point, then it's a categorical imperative. Categorical, everybody. It's an imperative, it's a command. So typically in medical ethics, they'll have a deontological approach to the right to privacy, but they do it from on two different points of view. One is they recognize that an individual has personal autonomy. So in other words, whatever we talked about in the rights of our own autonomy, whether it's body integrity or moral, we would think that we have a right to that. And we want to rule based on that. So then we kind of put it into Kant's categorical imperative, and we think, but then could I will that everybody has a right to that? And we would say, yes. It kind of works, right? So the personal autonomy would be a really good way to make an argument for Kant's deontology being applied to the moral support for medical privacy. It's one of like the principles or maxims that we could develop. The other one is personal dignity. We realize that this stuff, even if it's just embarrassing, but it could also be, you know, extremely, how do you want to say, maleficent towards us. It could really, you know, affect us in ways. I mean, think about certain medical conditions. Like if you have an autoimmune disease, let's say that you have multiple sclerosis, and you go to the doctor for this, you would not want to disclose that to your employer. You would like to think in the best of all worlds, well, what are they going to do? Well, you know, it depends on how it's affecting their health insurance. But I would not, I mean, I wouldn't trust that kind of information, even working for a religious institute. I wouldn't trust them with that, right? So personal dignity, if you're going to say that there's certain dignity that's due me, right? Because remember Kant's claim that a person should never be used as a means to an end, but only an end in themselves. So we can never use somebody else for something else. So I can't disclose somebody's private information for some other reason. I would be using that person as a means to an end. And that goes against their own dignity. So Kant would ask, well, if I will that for myself, can I will that for everybody? The answer is yes. So that's another pretty good underpinning for moral support for medical privacy. Now, with utilitarianism, and I'm using this sort of, you know, as a synonym with consequentialism, you know, this is Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill. So here we're saying that we want the greatest good for the greatest number of people, right? So it's an end justifies the means. We're not worried about how we got there. We're worried about the consequence. But could we develop a rule that's going to give the best overall outcome for everybody involved, so we can generate the most happiness for the most amount of people? Now, this isn't Kantian asking, you know, is it good for me? Is it good for everybody else? This is it good for everybody? And you could probably say, yes, you know, these issues that we have surrounding privacy and the protocol and laws in effect to protect patients' privacy, these are very good rules. And they do contribute to overall happiness. So this would be like three good ways that we can have underpinnings for moral support with medical privacy. At consequentialism, if you remember, it didn't take into consideration like the overall, but just what was going on in these particular circumstances. So it's a little more difficult because we don't know that the circumstances, you know, themselves are going to line up with another particular incident, and then therefore we can be very inconsistent with the protocol that we have. So even though this isn't like crash utilitarianism and I'm going to get what I want, this would be a group of people trying to determine what's the best thing to do here. But it gets very spotty that way. We need a little bit more global ethics so that we can apply it across the board, so that we have everybody in the medical field working in unison, so people can have the same level of expectations of privacy regardless of where they're going, you know, at least within a region. It might differ, and the laws do differ from state to state, but as long as you stay within the network of your state, you should expect and, you know, ought to be able to anticipate having the same level of privacy afforded you, all right? Any question on that, guys? I don't like this as much as being in a classroom, but hey, it is what it is, you know? Now, the reason why these laws are in place aren't just because somebody thought it was a good idea. There's a reason why people want information about us that we would otherwise want to keep private. And some of it's good and some of it's nefarious. right? In other words, all of the privacy information, just think of anything from the testing that we have, information about our lifestyles, which that's part of this too, right? Just because you're a little overweight and your cholesterol's high and you have a sedentary lifestyle, you don't want your, doctor going playing around at golf and talking about, this heavy set guy doesn't do anything on the side. You don't expect those things to be breached. So there are ways that people would want access to this that are good, but they still can't have it. In other words, so a patient gets released into their house, and the relatives need, how much do they need to know about that person's particular medical history in order to take care of them? They need to know only what's necessary for good care and for safety. They don't need access to the full-blown record. It's not theirs to have, right? They might want access to it. They might even think that we can do better care. Now, in my situation with my mother, I was already the medical power of attorney. So there was no discrepancy between what was being given to her and given to me in terms of privacy. And I did think that would help. So I get it. So if somebody says to me, it doesn't make any sense, isn't the more I know, the better? Well, yes, but it's up to the patient to disclose that. It's not up to the healthcare worker to disclose that. The healthcare worker can disclose things that are public knowledge, right? I mean, so if the person returns home, everybody, I don't know, if the mayor's sick and the mayor's left the hospital and now the mayor's back home, and you as a healthcare worker say, hey, did you hear the mayor went back home? You're not sharing anything that's private. It's already been public knowledge. But there are certs, it still is better to simply say, and going to be safer legally, by all means, I understand how that information would help you. Ask her to share or him to share whatever is necessary and leave it at that. Now, those are some of the good things, and there's probably others. But there's also a lot of nefarious things that can be done with this information. In other words, we're in a little different situation now in healthcare insurance because previous conditions are covered. But before the Affordable Care Act went into effect, if you had a previous condition, you were locked. I mean, by locked, I mean, it's happened. It happened to me. I don't care if they raise your insurance $800 a month. You can't switch. Nobody else will take you, right? So maybe we're not as worried about that with the health insurance at this point, but we are certainly worried about that in terms of life insurance and stuff, right? So if life insurance companies were able to get a hold of some sort of, medical knowledge of your potential health or disease, to think that they're not going to use it against you would be ridiculous. They would not think twice. Even DNA testing, we don't have to put on our aluminum foil hats for this. And I'm getting a lot of general, blurbs here. But I would not get DNA testing because I don't trust that to be private. I think at some point that's going to be breached. Now, that being said, I realize on a large level, these 23andMe, it's entertainment. I mean, even with monozygotic twins, they've had evidences of these twins being shown in totally different ethnicities, which did not happen, right? But I just have a fear that, it's a fear enough to know that we're going electronic, that there's going to be enough breaches. And if that breach gets out, we're in trouble. Could you imagine even think of people who have great wealth? They might be very, how about this? Let's forget about that. This is a little bit of a gray area. What about our politicians? I mean, they are running for public office, but their health is private. So, we don't have any strict rules on this, but we kind of want to know what their health is, but do we really have access to everything? So, I mean, we have three candidates, between the two that are on the Democratic side and the Republican that are going to have some sort of health issue. We'd like to know that, per se, because it's going to affect perhaps our vote, but then what rights do they have to that themselves? So you could see why having information about these particular issues that are normally kept private could be instrumental and used in nefarious ways, all right? Now let's just talk about the patients and why this is important. The reality is that when any of us go into the doctor, we're already feeling not well and we're feeling very vulnerable. And oftentimes we're put into situations that even increase the level of embarrassment and vulnerability. So we're already going to be a little bit unguarded in how we understand this care to play out. which means that we're probably going to be a little hesitant in what exactly we disclose. So, when a patient might be asked, do you smoke? Yes. How much do you smoke? Usually people guess on the low side. Guess. Same thing with drinking, they're on the low side. All these types of things. So if you don't have, if you have somebody in your, like a friend or a family member that you feel absolutely comfortable with, I mean, you can say anything to, and you know that there's no judgment going to come back to you, count yourself amongst the blessed. Because that's a real sense of trust that you have with that person. And that person's going to do the best to nurture it. They don't want anything to disrupt it. Well, this is the same way with the healthcare industry. The doctor knows that the level of trust is going to have a direct and immediate effect on your level of healthcare, perhaps your ability to work towards some sort of healing and such. So anything that they can do to maintain trust is important. And I'll give you a personal example in a second, but I'll do it with adolescence. With adolescence, you have this emerging autonomy, right? So you have young people that are just starting to, like, in a sense, practice what it's like to have a patient-doctor relationship, or let's just say a healthcare worker-patient relationship. So for them, they're learning. And they're probably they're, in other words, the lines that they're trying to develop, or the healthcare worker is trying to develop, very fragile. It's not going to take too much for this to sort of be disrupted and perhaps even be broken. So it's very important for, even at a young age, that this level of trust is established, and the rules that are in place, based, whether it's utilitarianism or Kantian ontology, that have formed these rights to privacy, is a way that the patient gets supported morally. Okay, so let me give you my story, and then I'll take any questions before we move on. Well, even though I'm not that old, I know you probably think I am, but I literally remember the little community I was in, a little Italian community, that my mother, when I was very young, there was still a doctor would come to the house. Now, I never had that experience, but I remember going to his house. Well, his office was a house. It was just a house on Main Street. When you went into the front room, that was the lobby. And I would go there for, I guess, physicals and such for sports in high school. And, if I was willing to go and literally take the phone calls and take messages, and he would give me free care. So one time my dad was around there, because my dad was with me, and he goes, I'll just stay here and drink some coffee. And we both back into the room, and the doctor starts asking me about, do you smoke? And I said, no, I don't smoke. But I was always one of those kids that always looked like he did something wrong. I just had that face, right? So he looked at me, and he looked at my dad looking at me, and he figured, I'm just not telling the truth. So he told my dad, he goes, hey, when are you going to have another cup of coffee? And my dad, okay. And then he asked me after he left. He goes, so, hey, he goes, seriously, do you smoke? And I said, no, I really don't. He goes, okay. Now, I have to tell you what that did for me. I grew up at a time where I didn't think adults had my back. I thought anything I said to an adult was just much like saying to my parent, I mean, it was the old day where if somebody caught you running their bike across the lawn, they'd call your mom, and you didn't need anything. You get slapped, right? So I just thought that whatever I tell this doctor, is he going to tell everything? But nothing ever came out of that. And it gave me a deep level of respect for him. It gave me a deep level of respect for the profession. And I think it helped build trust that I don't think one thing or other about telling my physician anything. I act like that, so I'm going into confession there. And it's a lockbox, right? And this is back when smoking wasn't even that bad. This particular doctor didn't smoke, but in all honesty, I've been in rooms where the doctor comes walking in with smoking a cigarette, which is like bizarre. They couldn't even imagine that today, but we live in a different world. Okay. Any questions on medical privacy or the moral support, the ontology, utilitarianism, any of that? Now, the goal here is, and I'm not going to give detail about these particular court cases. I'm not a legal expert. And this is just to give like a general swath of the evolution of thought, and how privacy sort of, as obviously is part of our Bill of Rights, but how it entered into various court cases and then made its way into the medical field and such, right? We all kind of have this idea. Oh, something I wanted to say as a backdrop. When I was talking about the patient's threshold, I just thought about this. I wonder if the ethos will change in 20 to 30 years, because people tend to have a higher threshold of sharing today than they did 30 to 40 years ago. You know, you see people putting pictures up on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, things that I couldn't even imagine ever showing anybody when I was younger. I remember when my daughters were younger, if we were at the beach or something, they'd take pictures of themselves and want to put it up on their Snapchat or whatever they were using at the time. And I kept saying, why are you putting a picture of yourself in a bikini on social media? And they're like, well, Dad, only my friends can see it. And I said, would you take a picture of yourself and hand it out to 50 random people outside of a Walmart? No. I said, then why would you put it on the internet where it's going to be there forever and millions can get it, right? So we don't kind of have the same sense of what is or is not private. And you see people that, you know, you don't have to go back to the 1950s to know that even the 70s and 80s, people typically would go out shopping and, you know, try to at least be presentable. Well, today, you know, we have the famous, you know, Walmart dress scenes, right, where people wear anything going out. So I wonder if people will become more casual with this, if somehow this isn't going to affect the ethos in 20 to 30 years. And then the only reason I say that is that, you know, as young people come up, they might have even a lower threshold. They might think it's cool to take a selfie of themselves in the hospital bed and post it, right? That's, I don't know how exactly that would work, but you know, obviously you get out of the camera, that type of thing. Anyway, let's go back to this evolution of thought. Now, one thing I never really understood when I first got into philosophy years ago, and it was one of the most exciting things for me, is that it has an historical component in the sense that most people accept their present culture and the present cultural ethos as standard. Like, whereas this is how it's always been. So a lot of the rules that we have now, you know, providing with Hipaa and other privacy rules, you know, we tend to think that they've been here a while. But we think about a lot of things. Philosophy studies like the history of ideas. And if you take anything like a particular culture, like today, I could probably point out where that particular incident comes from. If somebody says, well, I believe this, I could say, okay, well, you know, I can tell you right now that that's, you know, very Hegelian. Even though you don't might know anything about that guy, here's how it's transcribed. Or, hey, what you just said, that sounds like a lot of the dialectical stuff, you know, Marx and Foucault talked about. Well, I don't know who those people are. Doesn't much matter. So, you know, nothing develops, you know, in a vacuum. There's always, you know, historical things that have affected the evolution of something. And that's happened here, which is why I'm bringing this up. Because I'll start with the Comstock laws, but I can even go back. Like when I teach human sexuality sometimes, individuals will ask, well, what do you think about the sexual revolution? I'm always saying, well, what do you mean by the sexual revolution? They almost always mean the 1960s. But that's not it. You'd have to go back to the 1800s. You have to start asking questions about, you know, not just, you know, Comstock laws. You have to start asking questions about Thomas Malthus and what else was affecting the ethos of the time, right? But these Comstock, well, first of all, let me back up a little bit. It's not up here. Have you guys ever heard of blue laws? Okay. Blue laws were the laws that prohibited the operation of businesses or sales on Sundays, okay? So even me growing up until, I don't know when they stopped, late 70s, 80s, I don't know. Stores were closed on Sundays. Everything was closed. If you were going to a picnic or something at a, you know, at a state park on Sunday, get gas, get your food, get everything on a Saturday because Sunday everything's closed. As a matter of fact, you know, we're all kind of like in our lockdown mode, and you know, maybe the shelves on the supermarket's a little more bare than they used to. You know, I was talking to my wife today, and I said, you know, this is a lot like the 70s. I mean, we're so used to having, I mean, so much selection, so much abundance that we don't know of any other way to live. When my daughters were in high school, we had an exchange, well, not an exchange student, just a foreign student that came over for about a month. Came from Germany. She could not get over the size of the vehicles. She never saw so many trucks. Why do people own trucks? Why were all these SUVs? Why do you need one of those? Even houses, they're used to very small accommodations. Stopped at a supermarket. This wasn't a big super Walmart. This was just a local grocery market, privately owned. And when she saw the cereal aisle that took up an entire aisle all on one side, flabbergasted. Couldn't even understand it, right? So we have a different way of life here in the United States than even elsewhere. And so I already told my wife, I said, you know, the little community I grew up in, I remember going, my mom would send me, hey, do you want some lentil soup or something? Yeah, Ma. Okay, go over to Leo Costello's and get some soup. I remember going there, and the one shelf they had like 4 shelves high, and it literally was just like, it looked like somebody's counter. There was like, you know, various things sitting on it. It wasn't like stacks of stuff. And I told my wife, I said, what we're doing now, for me personally, this isn't even really a sacrifice. I feel bad because we live kind of simply anyway. But when I go to the markets, it just looks like things did when I was younger. The blue laws just remind me of that because you were used to things being shut down. You're used to not just going whenever you want, wherever you want, that type of thing. But these blue laws, essentially, I'm just trying to get at the ethos of the time. You have what they would call the WASP, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants that were in the legislature at the time and had that real Puritan sense. The Comstock laws were a way to prohibit the traveling of what they would call obscene material. Obscene material would be anything that's pornography, sex toys, or contraception. All right. So it was illegal to transfer those things, particularly over state lines. And you have then, as you come into the 20th century, first of all, you have the Spanish flu wiping out, 600 some thousand people just in the United States. You have World War I hitting. You still have Thomas Malthus and this understanding of overpopulation in the back of your head. And you have Margaret Sanger and the beginning of the birth control movement. And that's sort of tied into the eugenics movement that's all going on. So there's like a real stew that's going on. And Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, is trying to get these Comstock laws overturned because she's an advocate for contraception. As a matter of fact, she gets arrested and she's found guilty through one of the Comstock laws. But nonetheless, the ethos just wasn't there. By the time World War II hit and we saw the tragedies that were going on with the Holocaust, the eugenics movement, that pseudoscience kind of went off to the side. And by the time you get into the 60s, you do have a sexual liberation of sorts, okay? So you have post-war, you have individuals who, have lived in the, white picket fences, nice new home, and that false reality was kind of seen for what it was. You have the invention of the pill with, Pinkers in late 1950s, and by 1960 and 61, it was actually available for use. And then you have the assassination of John F. Kennedy and his brother, and you have Vietnam War starting up. So think about like a whole new stew going on, and then this idea, quite frankly, of the rock and roll, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's not a cliche. I mean, those things were all intercombined. Which brings me to the next thing. By the time you get to the mid 60s, you have Griswold versus Connecticut, which made a determination that couples that are having sex it's only married couples, right? This is not about bodily autonomy arguments. So what they did was, if you have couples that are having sex in their own room, in their own house, they're married, the government needs to stay out of that. In other words, the bedroom sacrosanct. So since there's no right to contraception built into the Bill of Rights, I'll let somebody who's a legal scholar explain exactly what the penumbra is, but they talk about it just kind of exists in the shadows of it. So they made a connection between the right to privacy, which is in the Bill of Rights, and a person's use of contraception, which is part of the sexual act that the government should stay out of. So they were able to make that legal argument, and at this point, and the Comstock laws are officially overturned, and contraception is no. And by the way, even the literature for contraception was deemed pornographic. So if somebody even in the early 60s would have wanted access to contraception, even that would have been difficult. But just getting the literature, a physician would get in trouble for it. Here you're starting to see, and the reason I'm pointing this out, you start to see the inclusion of a right to privacy being connected to something that's at least pharmaceutical, right, and has to do with the healthcare industry. Now, by the time you get to Roe v. Wade, now the same decision that was used and the right to privacy that was for the Griswold versus Connecticut ruling, now they're using that same right to privacy. In other words, saying that a woman has a right to reproductive health, including abortion, and that too has a right to privacy. Now, the difference between abortion and contraception is that it's not just a permissive type thing. This, whether you're for it or against it, and whether it's particularly safe or not, is not the case. It's still an invasive medical procedure, all right? So now you have medical personnel dealing a little more intimately in this. And the whole idea of, stare decisis, this idea they have precedence and you keep it up. I wish I could remember his name, but there's a law professor at Villanova, and he's also an ethics professor who, right now, not a little side note, there's a law down in Louisiana that's challenging, not challenging Roe v. Wade, that's inappropriate to say that way, but it's challenging whether or not physicians must have admitting rights to hospitals in order for them to license part abortions. So people are seeing this as a way to put a chink in the armor. So the law professor from Villanova thinks that, first of all, he's opposed to abortion. He admits that, but he also recognizes that there is issues with Roe v. Wade that perhaps need to be fixed. And even Ruth Bader Ginsburg thinks that. So here's a Supreme Court justice who is fully in support of women's right to abortion, who wishes that it wasn't decided this way because she sees that if it does get overturned, it'll be on that particular issue. But nonetheless, the whole point of this was to show that now we have privacy rights entering a little more intimately into the healthcare. And I won't go into exactly the background of Waylon Rowe, but this had to do with what can show up on pharmaceuticals and such. But you just have privacy issues. This is all you need to know. Privacy issues that are being more intimately connected to the healthcare industry. The whole point of this isn't to be comprehensive. It's just to show you a real broad connecting of the dots. A lot of the rights that we talk about today, even though they have philosophical backgrounds and they're based on custom, have been through a lot. They came from a lot of decisions from various state level and maybe even district level findings from judicial decisions. But it all kind of followed this trajectory. Any questions on that? Okay. You guys want to get out your phones? Now, this is a real life case study. I just added one or two things to it, but nothing really substantial. And I don't have the ending to it. I wish I did because I'm everybody out. But nonetheless. So Katrina is this 15-year-old female, and she was injured during a sporting event in a Pennsylvania high school. She was brought to the emergency department. It was evident she was going to need some sort of radio imaging, and they suspected just by visible observation that it probably will require immediate surgery. So when the nurse starts asking the basic screening questions, are you pregnant? Katrina feels a little embarrassed due to her parents, being present right next to her. So she replies no. And the follow-up question is, are you involved in sexual activity? She had an awkward glance, and the nurse realized that she was looking at her parents. So there's more background on this that I didn't put there. So anyway, she says, well, look, this is really just standard precaution for us to ask this. So Katrina nodded, she understood. So they administered a pregnancy test, and Katrina and her parents both were told the results were negative. So I'm just going to ask you, generally speaking, was the medical facility's policy in breach of Katrina's privacy by administering a pregnancy test? And was that nurse's suspicion unwarranted? Oh, give me a second, guys. I guess I didn't get rid of them all. In this particular case, it is no, and it's definitely no. It is true that adolescents typically aren't truthful, but there's very serious concerns. The reality is that anytime an anesthesiologist is going to be involved in something, they're going to want to know if this person's pregnant. They're not going to take their word for it. So if the female is between the a menstruating age and well, at least into the menopause, mid-50s, they're going to require this because there's been legal cases where they were told no because the person didn't think they were pregnant, and then they were pregnant and caused a miscarriage. I've even read case studies in surgeries where A person said they were not pregnant. There was no way they were pregnant. And then they have actually, being treated, they're having a partial hysterectomy. And when the surgeon went in, realized the person was pregnant, closed them back up, that they subsequently lost the child. So there's very deep moral concerns and legal concerns that are involved with this. So that's going to be a standard question, to be honest, right? Okay, so it turns out Katrina's injury was minor. She quickly recovered. Now, Katrina lives with her mother and her father, and in truth, she has been sexually active for over a year. She has a steady boyfriend, Bob, and he's now the second person she's had intercourse with. She said they usually use a condom. When they don't, he withdraws in order to avoid pregnancy. Um, so now, prior to becoming the next school year, she needed an exam to participate in sports. So when she presented to the family physician, Dr. Kingston, who knew her, indicated through a blood test, which he suspected, that she was pregnant. Well, Katrina was shocked. She goes, I can't understand how I'm pregnant. How could this happen, given the precautions? Dr. Kingston tried to explain the risk of pregnancy despite efforts to avoid it, including the risk of diseases. And he said, the absence is really the only certain way, but, by not using a condom, you were taking a real chance. Katrina didn't quite seem to understand that and reasserted that this could not have happened, and he wanted to know if the doctor was sure. Dr. Kingston said, yes, I am sure. And he said, look, more so now than ever, you're going to need the support of your family. And Katrina insisted that you do not tell my family. And she said, as a matter of fact, she goes, I want an abortion. So must Dr. Kingston involve Katrina's parents if she wants an abortion according to abortion laws in PA? Now, if something like this comes up on the exam, because somebody else asked last period, you're not expected to know state laws. If I ask you a question like this, I will put the information on there for you to glean and I think we know each other well enough that if you do see something like this on the exam, you're thinking, how could I possibly know? Just take the exam. I'll realize that too, and it's not going to hurt you. Okay. In this particular case, yes, according to the Pennsylvania law, one parent has to consent or guardian. All right. Now, there is something that's known as a judicial bypass. So if this minor did want to have an abortion, regardless of the parents, they could appeal through juvie court, and it's free, and they will be assigned a lawyer. And if it's granted, they'll be given a document that allows them to have an abortion without their parents' consent. But that's a side issue. Now, Dr. Kingston explained to Katrina that Pennsylvania state law mandates that he inform at least one parent. That parent's going to have to consent. Katrina refuses and tells Dr. Kingston that I'll cross the border into Maryland with my boyfriend. I'll have the abortion there because I heard there are ways around it. So at this point, she's pregnant. And though a physician may keep information from the parents, Dr. Kingston thought these rules ridiculous and harmful. He untruthfully told Katrina, you might as well tell your parents now because they're going to find out sooner or later. After all, they're going to get the insurance statements and then they're going to realize you're pregnant. Katrina adamantly rejected Dr. Kingston's advice, and she harshly told him, I'm going to go and get another physician. Anyway, that evening, Dr. Evenson calls Katrina's mother, and he told her that Katrina was pregnant. Her mother, though shocked, was thankful for the information and said that she would support her daughter and will discuss the available options. Well, Dr. Kingston was very relieved he made the call. Get things out of the way. My apologies. You're getting to see the answers on the test. So did Dr. Kingston deceive Katrina about parental approval? And is that deception morally appropriate? Yeah, you're right. No, he cannot ethically and morally do that. this is almost, irreparable breach of trust. For Katrina to build a trust relationship with any healthcare worker, it's going to take some time. So absolutely not. I have one more question based on this. Every time I go over there, my response is my mouse pointer disappeared. Was it morally wrong to inform Katrina? And you can even think, was it legally wrong? I'm going to guess that's everybody. Yes, that's right. She has this status now that would be emancipated teen. And she now has certain autonomous rights. So if I were the parent, would I want to know? Yes. But legally, I could not force them to tell me that. All right. This is the ending nobody likes. So that evening, her mother engaged Katrina in a conversation and went badly. Even though Katrina's mother tried to approach with kindness and understanding, things got out of hand, and after a serious verbal fight, some pushing occurred. Katrina was slapped, causing some scratches. Katrina threatened to call the authorities to report the event as abuse, but instead left the house. A week later, she hadn't returned, and her mother has no idea where she is or where she was. Everybody kind of booed me on that one last class, and I wish I had something else to say, but I didn't. Let me I want to stop sharing screen per se. Let me say something though. If you were in that room